Tensions erupted the moment her microphone crackled to life. The broadcast began with the typical bombastic introduction, the host hyping up a so-called spirited discussion. But the atmosphere in the studio was anything but playful. Jasmine Crockett, dressed in a simple yet elegant jacket and skirt combination, took her seat at the end of a long polished table. Opposite her sat a row of panelists, each armed with notes, statistics, and long-harbored biases. Her arrival was late by only a few minutes, traffic, the typical bustle of the city, nothing unusual, but from the moment she walked onto the set, the tension felt carefully orchestrated. Under the bright studio lights, cameras whirring, and a live audience watching from behind a window of glass, she could see how the stage was set against her. She was acutely aware of every eye upon her, from the camera operators to the production assistants, to the veteran anchor whose voice boomed through the speakers. The host offered a formal introduction, but the words had an undertone she couldn't miss, a hint of condescension, a subtle tilt in tone as if already positioning her as an outlier or an unwelcome force. Then came the first question, a pointed remark about her so-called controversial stance on a policy. She drew in a silent breath, felt her heart beat heavily in her chest, and offered an answer both measured and articulate. Yet no sooner had she begun speaking than a panelist at the far right end of the table snorted and cut her off. Laughter rippled across the panel as if on cue. Jasmine's face remained calm. Her composure was a shield she had honed over years of legal experience and public service. The dryness in her throat subsided as she fought to keep an even tone. But something about that moment, how swiftly they tried to delegitimize her, how quickly the anchor smirked and leaned closer to the microphone, told her she was going to have to fight for each sentence. She clenched her hands beneath the table, determined to stand her ground without letting anger cloud her words. But make no mistake, there was fire within her, and she refused to let these panelists stifle it. They knew exactly which buttons to push. They began throwing around loaded phrases, calling her views naive, idealistic, or utterly lacking in practicality. Another panelist, an older figure known for championing the status quo, scoffed at her attempts to clarify. He claimed she was too green to understand the complexity of national-level politics. Eyes flickered to the anchor, who smirked like a ringmaster, watching the beginnings of a cruel spectacle. Jasmine felt an almost physical wave of dismissal roll over her, as though the entire stage had decided before she even spoke that her perspective was worthless. She briefly glanced at the cameras and wondered how many viewers at home were seeing through this orchestrated charade. In a calmer world, she might have taken a moment to gather her thoughts and deliver a composed rebuttal. But here, the momentum was a roaring tidal wave, intent on sweeping her voice away. Another question flung at her was so tangential that it felt designed merely to trip her up. She answered politely, weaving facts and moral imperatives together, but each time she tried to conclude, the panelists exchanged glances and suppressed giggles. The camera cut to the anchor's face, revealing a studied expression of concern, feigned empathy that was actually an invitation for the others to escalate. The atmosphere grew sharper. Jasmine's voice remained steady, each word a bead of carefully crafted logic. Yet the tension in the air bristled with a kind of cruelty. She noticed the production assistants at the edges of the set, their faces drawn. They looked uneasy, as though they could sense an injustice unfolding. But they could do little more than watch. She caught the eye of one who nodded slightly in a gesture that felt encouraging, if only in the smallest way. That fleeting empathy gave her the resolve to press onward. Her moral center demanded she speak truth even in the face of ridicule. She had come here today to discuss critical issues, reforms that most politicians seemed eager to bury under red tape and bureaucratic procedures. But instead of a reasonable conversation, it was a gauntlet of dismissive jokes and personal jabs. The show boasted that it was an impartial platform to debate policy, but in practice, it was a stage for boisterous personalities to grandstand. Jasmine knew the real stakes. Behind the laughter and the mocking was a deep-seated fear of genuine systemic change. She represented a threat to their carefully guarded norms. One of the panelists, renowned for wielding sarcasm as a weapon, zeroed in on a proposal she had championed. With a condescending eye roll, he recited half-truths that twisted her words, painting her position as reckless. There you have it, he concluded, turning to the anchor with a smug grin. She wants to reshape decades of established protocol overnight. He paused for effect, then added with forced civility, "Isn't that adorable?" Laughter echoed through the studio. The sense of being in a lion's den was palpable. But Jasmine refused to cower. She leaned into the microphone, speaking slowly, each syllable etched with unwavering conviction. She pointed out the inaccuracies, laid out the facts as meticulously as she could in the short time allowed. Though the mockery persisted, a hush gradually wrapped around the set. There was a strength in her voice that hadn't been anticipated. The panelists exchanged uncertain glances. Even the anchor's posture stiffened. What they had assumed would be an easy target was turning out to be a formidable opponent. Still, the segments dragged on in this vein. Any spark of rational debate got overshadowed by theatrics. They took phone calls from so-called experts who contributed little more than backhanded insults, fueling the mockery. Headlines splashed on the bottom of the screen in bold text, "Radical Reformer Battles Seasoned Political Veterans," as though the entire affair was a carnival attraction. The set was supposed to feel polished and professional, but a sense of mania lurked just beneath the surface. Jasmine found herself yearning for just one genuine question. She wanted to speak about the people these policies would help, the families in her district, the justice issues that had pushed her to run for office in the first place. Instead, she was forced to parry jokes about her inexperience, her background, even her demeanor. One panelist, whose name tag identified him as a former high-ranking official, slipped into a diatribe about how emotions have no place in policy. He glanced at her as though her passion was a weakness, and the camera captured that look with precise cruelty. She thought of responding with a measured retort about how change requires empathy, how real leadership demands emotional intelligence. But before she could speak, they rolled to a commercial break. The host signaled for them to pause, and the camera feed cut. Yet the mockery didn't stop there. Off-air, the panelists casually continued their jibes, now unfiltered by broadcast standards. They spoke about her as though she weren't in the room, referencing older statements she'd made, quoting them out of context for cheap laughs. She could have argued. She could have asserted herself, but she conserved her energy for the broadcast, determined that if she was going to speak, it would be on the record. She sat in silence, eyes forward, ignoring the swarm of antagonistic chatter. Though her heart pounded with quiet fury, she maintained the calmest exterior she could muster. When they returned from the break, the anchor introduced another topic, again skewed to cast doubt on Jasmine's credibility. She took a breath and answered in a low, steady tone, determined not to surrender her voice, but the repeated interruptions frayed her patience. At one point, a particularly smug panelist leaned across the table, his voice dripping with scorn. "Representative Crockett," he said, emphasizing her name with a sneer. "You're quite passionate, aren't you? Perhaps a bit too passionate for the delicate business of governance." He let out a theatrical sigh. "We all admire enthusiasm, but at some point practicality must take precedence, don't you think?" That final phrase was delivered with such feigned politeness it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She felt the sting, but she willed herself not to show it. Keeping her voice as steady as she could, she responded that passion for people's well-being is the foundation of effective governance, and that change doesn't come from polite complacency. The tension in the room thickened. Viewers at home could likely sense it through their screens. The show concluded with a forced handshake and insincere smiles. The anchor thanked her for appearing, but the entire sign-off felt orchestrated to portray her as overwhelmed or defeated. The final shot was a wide angle of the panelists, with Jasmine on the far end, almost cropped out. Then the cameras faded, the host's voice promised another exciting segment after the break, and the bright lights dimmed. Without the cameras rolling, the panelists rose from their seats, gathering their papers with casual indifference. One or two offered curt nods in Jasmine's direction, but there was no pretense of collegiality. She thanked the production team quietly, offered a gracious word to the makeup artist who hurriedly removed her microphone. Then, in near silence, she exited the studio. Her back felt rigid, her eyes stung from the glare of the lights, but her mind was elsewhere. on the injustice of the spectacle she'd just endured. She walked to a quiet corridor leading out of the building, thinking about the smirks and the dismissive laughter. Outside, the sky was overcast, matching her mood. She made her way to her car, pausing momentarily as a few bystanders recognized her. A teenage girl approached, eyes shining. "I saw you in there," the girl said, her voice trembling with admiration. "You did good. Don't let them get you down." That small encouragement felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. News of the interview spread quickly on social media. Within hours, clips of the panelists mocking her had gone viral. One snippet, barely 40 seconds long, captured them laughing derisively, while Jasmine spoke about a community initiative aimed at providing legal aid to impoverished families. The tone was painfully clear. Her compassion was being ridiculed by those who saw her as a political upstart. Online commentators either joined in the mockery or rallied to her defense. Messages of support mingled with sneering comments. Through it all, Jasmine remained guarded. She had dealt with criticism before, but something about the cruelty and the public nature of it all cut deeper this time. She watched in real time as her name trended, overshadowed by the scornful label, "too emotional." She recalled the way the older panelist had dismissed her, almost patting her on the head like a child who didn't know any better. The more she thought about it, the more determined she became. She refused to be silenced or shamed out of the discourse. In the days that followed, her staff urged her to move on, to focus on the next legislative fight, to let the spectacle die down on its own. But the clips continued to circulate. Commentators on other networks weighed in, replaying the footage with their own takes. Some chastised her for not confronting the panel more aggressively. Others mocked the entire segment as a cheap ratings stunt. But a quiet groundswell of support emerged from ordinary people who recognized that the panel's behavior was symptomatic of a deeper cultural issue, one where empathy and a drive for reform were seen as signs of naivete, especially when coming from someone who challenged the old guard. Jasmine tried to continue her work in Congress, drafting bills, meeting with constituents, pressing for investigations into systemic injustices, but she couldn't shake the lingering sense that her voice had been purposefully undermined in that broadcast. Even among colleagues, she overheard whispered remarks about her emotional meltdown on national television, a distorted retelling of the interview that had begun to take on a life of its own. She seethed at the manipulation. She'd never melted down or lost her composure. Her voice had been calm. Her arguments had been rational, yet the narrative constructed by these panelists was that she was unfit, too passionate, too out of control. It was a conversation with a longtime ally that finally galvanized her next move. Late one evening, she sat in her office, slumped over a stack of papers. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. In walked Miriam, an older woman with tired eyes but an unyielding spirit. Miriam had been one of Jasmine's key supporters since her early days. She placed a cup of tea in front of Jasmine and took a seat. "You're letting them shape the story," Miriam said gently. Jasmine looked up, her jaw clenched. "What am I supposed to do?" Miriam leaned forward. "Fight back on your own terms. You say you care about these issues? Prove it. Challenge them to a real conversation, but not on their turf. Host your own forum. Bring real people in. Show the world you're not this caricature they're painting." The idea ignited something in Jasmine. She realized that if she allowed the mockery to go unanswered, she'd be enabling this twisted portrayal to become the defining story. And so she began planning a public forum, a space where she could not only address the smear, but also delve into the policy details that the panelists had so arrogantly brushed aside. Over the next few weeks, she worked tirelessly with her small team to prepare an event. She chose a local community center, a place that represented the very heart of the neighborhood she served. Invitations went out not just to constituents, but to experts, local leaders, and pointedly, the very panelists who had mocked her on TV. Some scoffed at her invitation, some declined with sharp, snide remarks, but a few responded with tentative acceptance. Perhaps they thought it would be another chance to embarrass her, or maybe they believed they could dominate the conversation once again. Either way, Jasmine intended to be ready. Word spread on social media about the upcoming forum, and the hype grew. Supporters cheered her decision to reclaim the narrative, while critics dismissed it as a desperate stunt. The local press picked up on the story, running headlines about her challenge to the influential panelists. She knew that she was taking a risk. The same forces that had publicly mocked her could easily twist this forum into another spectacle. Yet her conviction burned too brightly to let that fear paralyze her. She wanted an honest conversation about policy, justice, and the role of empathy in governance. In the days leading up to the event, she immersed herself in research. She studied every statistic, prepared case studies, and enlisted testimonies from people who had been directly impacted by the policies she championed. She didn't want this to be about personal vindication alone, though the desire to clear her name was undeniably there. Above all, she wanted to refocus the discourse on the people whose voices were rarely heard. When the day of the forum arrived, the community center was packed to capacity. Rows of chairs filled the large hall, and a makeshift stage had been set up at the front. The air was electric with anticipation. Jasmine felt a surge of adrenaline as she stepped onto the stage to open the forum. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but as she spoke, she found her footing. She welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, and laid out the ground rules for civil discourse. There would be no shouting down, no mocking, and no personal attacks. If anyone violated these guidelines, they would be asked to leave. It was a bold move, practically a direct jab at how the TV show had operated. She could see a couple of the invited panelists seated near the front, arms crossed, wearing skeptical frowns. Cameras from local news outlets were positioned at the back, capturing every moment. The tension simmered as Jasmine began. She briefly referenced the viral clips, stating that she refused to let an orchestrated barrage of insults overshadow the issues that mattered. Then she segued into a compelling narrative about individuals who'd suffered under inequitable policies, weaving in personal stories that highlighted the moral weight of the reforms she advocated. At first, the panelists who had shown up appeared restless. One interrupted her to insert a remark about fiscal responsibility. Another sighed audibly as if bored. But in this forum, with a community audience watching attentively, their mocking tone didn't carry the same power. They were surrounded by the very people whose lives had been shaped by the policies in question. A local pastor stood up to explain how complicated legal barriers had forced families into homelessness. A public school teacher tearfully recounted how budget cuts had decimated her classroom resources. A single mother detailed her struggle to navigate bureaucratic red tape just to access basic social services for her child. Each testimony added a layer of emotional depth to what was so often treated as dry policy debate. Jasmine listened, nodded, and occasionally asked clarifying questions. The panelists looked increasingly uncomfortable, unsure of how to play the role of heckler in a room brimming with raw, authentic voices. In time, the forum opened up for questions and comments, and one of the mocking panelists took the microphone. His voice was measured, but one could hear the undercurrent of his usual patronizing tone. He launched into a critique of Jasmine's proposals, calling them unrealistic, too expensive, too broad, too idealistic, the same litany of dismissals she'd heard before. But now the difference was the setting. There was no laugh track, no host cutting her off mid-sentence, no orchestrated attempts to drown her out. She responded calmly, citing concrete data, referencing the personal testimonies that had just been shared. She posed counter-questions that forced him to justify the status quo. The people in the audience listened intently, and for once, the panelists' scoffs fell flat, echoing awkwardly in the silent room. He tried to deflect, but the community members pressed him for clarity. He stammered, pivoted, and eventually yielded the microphone. It was clear that the power dynamics had shifted. As the evening progressed, the conversation deepened. The once antagonistic panelists found themselves facing a crowd that was engaged, emotionally invested, and unwilling to accept superficial dismissals. This was no longer a televised spectacle with a captive audience at home, unable to speak back. This was a shared space where real people demanded real answers. Jasmine's confidence grew with each passing minute. She could feel the momentum building, a slow but steady tide of validation that her stance was not only rational but necessary. By the end of the forum, many attendees were standing, applauding her willingness to fight for policies that prioritized human dignity. She concluded by reiterating her commitment to address injustices, reminding everyone that real change required collective effort, not just the lone voice of a single politician. The applause at the end was thunderous. As she stepped away from the stage, a surge of relief and accomplishment washed over her. The risk she had taken felt worth it. The cameras had captured a completely different narrative than the one broadcast by that talk show. Here, she was not a naive. She was a leader offering solutions grounded in empathy and backed by facts. It was an undeniable counterpoint to the mockery that had trended so heavily online. In the days that followed, clips from the community forum went viral in a way few had anticipated. Snippets showed Jasmine patiently listening to constituents' stories, then providing clear, articulate responses. Another clip showcased a panelist's flustered reaction when confronted by a local grandmother demanding justification for cuts that affected low-income families. The emotional weight of these testimonies, combined with Jasmine's calm professionalism, struck a chord with viewers across the country. Social media buzzed with comments praising her fortitude, calling her a shining example of political courage. Even some conservative pundits grudgingly admitted that she had handled herself with poise. The tide had begun to turn, and the old narrative of too emotional was overshadowed by a new one. She's strong, she's informed, and she's not backing down. People who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before were now following her, donating to her causes, and volunteering their support. Yet the victory was not simply about personal vindication. It was about shining a light on how entrenched voices so often dismiss genuine calls for compassion as weakness. By providing a platform for the unheard, she had demonstrated that empathy was not merely emotional, it was strategic, powerful, and necessary for meaningful progress. The televised panel that had once ridiculed her found itself on the defense. Their social media pages were inundated with criticism for how they had conducted themselves. Some sponsors of the show began to question the wisdom of aligning with a platform that had blatantly mocked a sitting representative advocating for vulnerable communities. One of the panelists publicly apologized, stating that the show's format had encouraged sensationalism. It was a carefully worded apology, almost certainly influenced by mounting public pressure. While Jasmine harbored no illusions about changing every heart overnight, she recognized that a meaningful shift was already underway. Across talk radio, opinion columns, and online forums, people were debating the merits of empathy in governance, discussing how policy needed to be about people, not just theoretical constructs. She watched from her small congressional office as these discussions evolved, grateful that finally the narrative centered on the real issues rather than trivial personal attacks. But it was a single unexpected phone call that would set the stage for an even more dramatic showdown. Late one afternoon, as she was finalizing plans for an upcoming legislative session, her phone rang. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a producer for the same national news show that had aired the mocking panel. He sounded contrite, or perhaps just desperate for higher ratings. "Representative Crockett," he began, "we've seen your forum, people are talking about you everywhere. Our audience is interested in hearing your perspective again. We'd like to invite you back onto our program for a follow-up interview." She paused, the memory of the last ambush still raw in her mind. But something in her stirred at the offer. She recognized the potential risk of returning to the lion's den. Would it be another orchestrated farce designed to humiliate her anew, or had they genuinely changed their approach? The producer's tone made grand promises. "You'll have a fair chance to speak this time, we assure you. We see how your story resonates and we want to give you a platform to expand on it." The words sounded carefully chosen, perhaps even genuine, yet her instincts told her to remain cautious. She consulted with her team. Opinions were split. Some advised her to steer clear, to avoid giving the show any chance to manipulate her again. Others saw it as a critical opportunity to capitalize on the wave of public interest and drive home the message of reform on a broader stage. Ultimately, she decided to accept the invitation, but on one condition: there would be no ambush panel. She would engage in a moderated discussion one-on-one with the host. The producer agreed, hastily promising that the format would be fair. The announcement of her return to the show caused an immediate stir. Media outlets framed it as a rematch, as if it were a sporting event. Social media lit up with speculation about how the show would handle her this time. Some cynically predicted they'd simply try to tear her down again. Others believed the producers might have learned their lesson, given the backlash they'd faced. The day of the interview arrived quickly. Unlike the last time, she found herself feeling a mix of calm determination and underlying nervous energy. She dressed simply, not wanting anything to distract from her words. She arrived at the studio, greeted by a new set of producers and assistants who treated her with professional courtesy. The anchor, yes, the same one who had facilitated the mocking fiasco, greeted her in the hallway with a polite handshake, though she could see the tension in his eyes. They exchanged brief pleasantries before stepping onto the set. The lights flared to life, camera zoomed in, and a hush fell over the control room. The show's title sequence played, the music swelling in dramatic fashion. Then, with rehearsed composure, the anchor introduced Jasmine Crockett. This time, there was no immediate barrage of jeering panelists. Instead, it was just her and the anchor at a sleek glass table under soft lighting. He thanked her for graciously agreeing to return, and she returned his thanks, acknowledging that she hoped the discussion would be more productive than last time. He began with a question about her community forum, praising her for engaging directly with constituents. She spoke confidently, highlighting the stories of those impacted, emphasizing the need for empathy in policymaking. The anchor nodded, occasionally inserting mild objections or requests for clarification, but nothing close to the aggressive tactics from before. She almost couldn't believe the difference in tone, but she maintained her guard, waiting for the moment when a verbal trap might be sprung. About 15 minutes in, the anchor brought up the viral clips from her previous appearance. "Some say you were unfairly treated," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Others argue that you were too sensitive. How do you respond to those who think your emotions got the better of you?" She took a breath, letting a brief silence fill the air before answering. "I don't see compassion as a weakness," she said, her voice unwavering. "I see it as a catalyst for change. If people interpret that as being too emotional, then so be it, because at the end of the day, the legislation I work on affects real lives, people who face challenges that most of us couldn't fathom. It would be irresponsible not to feel something about that." The anchor studied her face, searching perhaps for a crack in her resolve. Finding none, he pressed on. "Do you think the nature of these televised debates undermines genuine discourse on policy?" She tilted her head, considering the phrasing. "I think sensationalism often overshadows substance, but it doesn't have to be that way. If we choose to prioritize depth and empathy, we can have robust debates without resorting to personal attacks or mockery." The anchor's eyes flickered. "And do you feel we mocked you?" he asked. It was a loaded question, but she refused to shy away. "I think the public clips speak for themselves," she replied. "I felt that my views were dismissed and ridiculed, not engaged with in good faith, but I'm here now, open to a more constructive conversation." For a moment, the anchor looked as though he might try to defend the show's earlier behavior, but then he let out a controlled sigh. "Fair enough, let's talk about the real issues then." And so, to her astonishment and relief, they did. They spent the remainder of the segment discussing the policies that drove her advocacy, the community stories that had galvanized her passion, and the importance of bridging the gap between rhetoric and reality. She spoke about healthcare disparities, criminal justice reform, educational inequities, issues that often drowned in partisan bickering but were, at their core, human tragedies waiting to be addressed. To his credit, the anchor remained mostly respectful, challenging her politely on certain points but not in a belittling or dismissive manner. When the interview concluded, the anchor thanked her, addressing her as Representative Crockett, courtesy notably absent in their first encounter. The camera panned out, the stage lights faded, and the show cut to a commercial. This time, there was no laughter, no panel of mockers, no sense of orchestrated humiliation. She was invited to wait in the green room afterward, where the anchor came by to shake her hand. He offered an apology that sounded more genuine now, and she thanked him for the opportunity to discuss real issues. Though the conversation was still cautious, She recognized that a shift had taken place. Perhaps it was self-serving on the show's part, a move to salvage credibility, but it was a victory for civil discourse nonetheless. Over the next few hours, social media lit up again, but this time the narrative was different. People circulated clips of the calm, respectful exchange, contrasting them with the earlier segments of ridicule. The difference was stark. Many praised Jasmine for maintaining her composure and effectively making her points, while others lambasted the show for its earlier behavior and belated attempt at redemption. Some critics still claimed she was too idealistic, but those voices were now drowned out by a wave of support. That evening, as she returned to her apartment, a mixture of exhaustion and elation washed over her. The city lights glowed below her windows. She found herself thinking back to that teenage girl who had approached her after the first debacle. That small moment of encouragement had carried her through some dark thoughts, reminding her that public service wasn't about appeasing pundits. It was about standing up for those who most needed a voice. She reflected on how quickly narratives could shift, how the court of public opinion could pivot from scorn to admiration. But the deepest lesson was that real impact came from doing the work on the ground, engaging communities and showing relentless dedication to truth. The sensationalism of cable news might come and go, but the lives of real people remained constant, needing care, support, and justice. Her phone buzzed with messages from well-wishers, colleagues, and even a few old political adversaries. Some apologized for doubting her, others offered collaboration on legislation. She felt a rush of gratitude, tempered by the knowledge that this was just one battle in a much larger war for systemic reform. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legislative sessions, community meetings, and media invitations. Offers poured in from various talk shows and podcasts. Her staff carefully screened them, wary of any more setups. Jasmine, however, refused to hide. She recognized that she had struck a chord with the public, and she intended to use that platform to continue championing the people she served. Her presence in national conversations grew. She delivered impassioned speeches on the House floor, garnering bipartisan attention. Clips of her articulate defenses of underprivileged communities began circulating widely, accompanied by the hashtag Crockett Courage, coined by her supporters. While some critics still derided her as too emotional, had begun to shift in meaning, less a critique of weakness, more a celebration of empathy and moral clarity. The shift was subtle but important. She recognized it in the way journalists asked their questions, no longer framing her passion as a liability. She felt it in the respectful nods from colleagues across the aisle who started to see her as a serious player. It was a slow cultural change, but a meaningful one. One night, while drafting a new bill aimed at expanding legal aid, she received an unexpected phone call from a senior representative with a reputation for skepticism about any form of reform. His tone was surprisingly cordial. "Representative Crockett," he said, "I've been following your interviews and your community forums. You've made a strong case for a more equitable justice system. I'm not saying I fully agree yet, but I'd be interested in hearing more and possibly collaborating." She suppressed a smile, recalling how he'd once dismissed her as a novice. "I appreciate that," she replied. "Let's schedule a meeting." That was how the seeds of real legislative progress began, through dialogue, respect, and a willingness to find common ground. As she ended the call, she felt a renewed sense of possibility. Perhaps it was naive to think so, but she allowed herself to indulge in hope. The cynics might still scoff, but tangible change often began with small steps like this. The weeks turned into months, and she witnessed the slow march of policymaking, committee hearings, backroom negotiations, amendments, and redrafts. It was painstaking and often frustrating, but she kept the stories of those who needed change foremost in her mind, using them as an anchor whenever she felt disillusioned. She continued to speak at town halls, to convene community forums, and to invite skeptics to engage with the people at the heart of these policies. Over time, that initial fiasco on national television receded in the public's memory. Some new controversy inevitably took its place in the ever-spinning media cycle, but the aftershocks of that moment continued to resonate for Jasmine. It had launched her into the spotlight, exposing her to ridicule that threatened to swallow her voice entirely. Yet in fighting back, first in that community forum and then in her second appearance on the show, she had not only reclaimed the narrative but also ignited a broader conversation about the role of empathy in governance. That conversation spread beyond her immediate circle, influencing grassroots organizations and budding politicians who saw in her story a blueprint for standing firm in the face of derision. Invitations to speak at universities and civic organizations streamed in. Students, activists, and younger politicians looked to her for guidance on how to handle the harsh glare of the media without compromising one's values. She relished these opportunities, seeing them as a chance to mentor a new generation of leaders who wouldn't be afraid to show compassion, who wouldn't shy away from moral clarity. Still, she never forgot the sting of the initial ambush. Late at night, she'd sometimes recall the panelists' laughter, the sound echoing in her mind. It served as a reminder of how fiercely the establishment could resist change, how easily they could label conviction as hysteria. But each time, she allowed that memory to fuel her resolve. Instead of dwelling on bitterness, she saw it as evidence of what she was up against, a system designed to trivialize the voices that demand justice. And so each morning she rose with a renewed commitment to keep pushing, to ensure that her so-called emotional approach to politics remained a strength rather than a weakness. The real turning point, however, came nearly a year after the event. A major piece of legislation aimed at overhauling aspects of the justice system made its way to the floor. Elements of her proposals were embedded in the bill, along with contributions from other lawmakers who had once scoffed at her emphasis on empathy. The debate leading up to the vote was fierce. Traditionalists warned of dire consequences, while reform advocates highlighted the urgent need to address long-standing inequities. Through it all, Jasmine stood firm, delivering impassioned remarks that invoked the voices of everyday people forgotten by the current system. When the vote tally was announced, the bill passed by a narrow margin. The chamber erupted in a mixture of applause, cheers, and disgruntled murmurs. Jasmine found herself embraced by colleagues who had grown to respect her tenacity. The moment felt surreal. She had always believed in the possibility of change, but to see a piece of legislation so directly influenced by the very empathy once ridiculed on national television felt like poetic justice. Journalists surrounded her in the corridor outside the chamber, clamoring for interviews. Flashbulbs went off, microphones appeared in her face. One reporter shouted, "Representative Crockett, how does it feel to achieve this victory despite being called too emotional?" Her answer was simple. "It feels like we're finally listening to the people who've been overlooked for far too long. And that's worth every bit of mockery they threw at me." As she left the Capitol that evening, she was greeted by a small crowd of supporters. They chanted her name, held signs applauding the newly passed legislation, and thanked her for her advocacy. She moved among them, shaking hands, exchanging words of gratitude and resolve. They snapped photos, posted them on social media with the caption, "This is what courage looks like." The next day, front-page headlines declared a milestone for reform. While detractors still existed, their voices seemed quieter now, overshadowed by the national conversation that had been sparked. Political analysts tried to dissect her strategy, some concluding that her approach to merge empathy with pragmatic solutions was an effective game-changer. Others dismissed it as a momentary trend. But for the families who would benefit from the legislation, for the individuals who now had a sliver of hope, this was no passing fad. It was a real shift in the way politics could be done. In the months that followed, Jasmine doubled down on her outreach efforts, continuing to hold forums, encouraging communities to stay engaged, and reminding them that the work had only begun. She was keenly aware that a single legislative win didn't dismantle the entire apparatus of systemic injustices. But it was a start, a solid step forward, and for that she was grateful. She found herself reflecting often on the chain of events. The mocking panel on national TV could have ended her career, or at least curtailed her reputation. Instead, it became a catalyst. She had risen from the crucible of public ridicule stronger, with a clearer sense of purpose. It was a lesson in resilience that she'd carry with her for the rest of her life. Word of her story even reached international audiences. A European news channel did a feature on her, calling it the Crockett Doctrine, a play on the notion that empathy should be at the core of governance. Though the phrase made her blush, she appreciated the global resonance of the message. And yet, through all the accolades and newfound influence, she remained mindful of the temptation to become the very thing she once fought against. She insisted on meeting regularly with constituents, holding roundtables with nonprofit organizations, and seeking counsel from experts in social work, public health, and community organizing. She reminded her staff that they served at the behest of the people, and that any drift into complacency or arrogance would be a betrayal of the very principles she had championed. The demands on her time grew, but she tried to balance the new responsibilities with self-care, a lesson learned the hard way. Late-night legislative battles, constant media scrutiny, and the emotional toll of carrying so many stories of pain and injustice could weigh heavily on her heart. Sometimes she would catch herself staring out a window, recalling how easily the panelists had mocked her passion, and wondering if all of it was worth the personal cost. Then she'd remember that teenage girl, the grandmother in the community forum, the single mother who no longer had to sleep in her car because of a small change in policy. She'd picture their faces and feel an immediate renewal of spirit. Inevitably, the original mocking panel tried to invite her back once more, this time for a special exclusive feature about her legislative success. The producers dangled the promise of a glowing profile, but she politely declined. She wasn't interested in rehashing the drama of her first appearance just to boost their ratings. She had moved on to substantive work, and she wanted them to know she wouldn't be a pawn in their spectacle. After her refusal, they ran a lukewarm segment praising the passing of the bill but minimizing her role in it. She simply shook her head and laughed when she heard their opinions no longer held any real power over her. Public sentiment had shifted, and so had her own understanding of the political game. On a crisp Saturday morning, Jasmine returned to the community center where she had held that first forum. She had promised to attend a neighborhood event celebrating new programs funded by the legislation. A modest crowd gathered to share food, music, and stories of how these programs were making a difference. Children ran around, laughing, oblivious to the struggles that had led to this moment of celebration. Their parents, grandparents, and neighbors greeted Jasmine like a friend. They offered homemade dishes, told her about small triumphs in their lives. The atmosphere brimmed with gratitude and a sense of renewed possibility. She felt a lump in her throat watching a child show her a new set of books donated to the local youth program. It was such a simple moment, yet held so much promise for the future. She found a quiet corner briefly to take it all in. The memory of that hostile studio still flickered in the back of her mind, but it was overshadowed by the warmth of this gathering. She realized that this was what real impact looked like. It wasn't about trending hashtags or viral clips. It was about tangible improvements in the lives of ordinary people. One of the event organizers asked if she could speak a few words. The crowd quieted, children hushed by their parents. She stood before them, humbled by the sheer positivity radiating from the room. She began simply, "I want to thank all of you," she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of sincerity, "not just for being here today, but for standing with me when times were tough. I've learned that no matter how loud the voices of mockery can be, they cannot drown out the collective power of a community determined to be heard." A wave of applause rolled through the crowd. She continued, "What we did together is prove that empathy is not a hindrance, it's a key to unlocking real, meaningful change. Policies are made by people, for people, and if we remove the humanity from that process, all we're left with is a cold, broken system." Heads nodded in agreement, some wiped away tears. The sunlight streaming in through the windows seemed to glow a little brighter. She spoke a bit more about the next steps, about the fight to expand these programs, and about the ongoing work to ensure nobody was left behind. She ended by thanking them once again, emphasizing that all her policy efforts meant nothing without their stories, their experiences, their willingness to share their truths. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the community center with a resonance far more profound than any TV studio fanfare could match. Afterward, she moved among the crowd, talking and listening, signing notebooks and taking pictures with families who wanted to document the day. She felt no rush, no urgent pull to another interview or event. For once, she allowed herself the time to simply be with the people who mattered. As she left the community center that day, a gentle breeze brushed against her face. She reflected on how drastically her life had changed since that fateful day on national TV. The humiliations, the viral mockery, the swarm of online commentary, none of it had derailed her commitment. Instead, it had forged a deeper well of determination, compelling her to stand taller, speak louder, and never again let ridicule define her narrative. What she did next, indeed, broke the internet, but more importantly, it cracked open the hearts of those who had once believed that empathy and passion had no place in the political arena. She had shown that authenticity could triumph over cynicism, that compassion could serve as a rallying cry for policy and not just an empty platitude. In the end, her story wasn't about one fiery moment of defiance on television. It was about the continuous process of standing firm against the forces that mock change, about channeling outrage into constructive dialogue, and about never losing sight of the real people whose lives hinge on the decisions made in corridors of power. And so she carried on, each day a new chapter, each new chapter a testament that resilience and empathy, far from being weaknesses, were the very cornerstones on which lasting social progress is built.